Hey, what's going on, guys? So I recently had a couple people ask me why I stopped doing PHP videos on my channel, and I definitely have not. I just tend to focus more on front and back end JavaScript because that's really my personal first choice when it comes to web development, mostly because of the full stack capabilities. And I really love JavaScript, but I also do love PHP. It was actually the first language I ever learned. I think it's very practical. It's easy for beginners. It's still very relevant. A ton of websites and applications use PHP. So I woke up yesterday and I read some of those comments, and I decided that I would do a little series and create something with just PHP. No framework, no Laravel, no Symfony, just pure PHP code, and we're going to create a REST API. Okay. Now, when you create a REST API with a framework like Laravel, it's pretty easy. A lot of it is automated. A lot of it you're not really seeing what's going on. It's very abstract, but we're just going to get into it and just code it out with straight, blank text editor, start from a blank text editor. So it will take longer than using a framework or something, or a library or whatever. But, I think that ultimately if you're interested in PHP, it's going to help you learn more of the language. And we're going to use object-oriented concepts. We'll have a database class and we'll have some models that we'll use that database class with, or database objects. And we'll also use PDO, which is PHP data objects, which has to do with connecting to our MySQL database. Now, I'm not going to go into like the concepts of a REST API or PDO. I have other videos explaining that stuff. I have a PDO crash course. I have a video called What is a REST API? I have a 20 video series on YouTube called PHP Front to Back that shows you all the basics. So those are some, I guess, prerequisites to this series. If you're interested and you really don't think you're ready for something like this, not that this is super advanced, but it's definitely not like beginner based, and I'm not going to explain every little thing like what a function does and all that stuff. All right, so let's get into it. I'm already talking too much. I'm using Postman for my HTTP client, basically to connect to my API and make post requests, get requests, and all that stuff. So I would suggest downloading that from getpostman.com, unless you use something else. If you want to get really technical and use something like curl or some command line tool. I know VS Code also has some REST client extensions, so whatever you want to use, but I would suggest Postman. It's really easy. And then for my environment, I'm just using XAMPP, which is just a suite that includes Apache, MariaDB, which basically is MySQL, and PHP. It also has PHP which we'll use to import our database. Okay, so to get started, we of course need some data. So I'm going to go to PHP which if you're using XAMPP, it's already included. If you're using like, I don't know, Vagrant or Docker or something, you can get that installed, or you can just use the SQL shell, whatever you want to use to import this. Now what you want to do is go to the GitHub repository that's in the description, and you'll see a file in there. Just, you can clone that repository or download it, and there's a file called myblog.sql, and we're just going to import that into a new database instead of creating everything manually. So I'm going to create a database called myblog, and then I'm going to go to import, choose file, and I'm just going to grab that SQL file and click go. And then if we look at our structure here, you'll see we have a post table and a categories table. And just to show you real quick, just in case you are creating this stuff manually, the structure, we have an ID in our posts, which is the primary key, auto increment, category ID, which is going to represent the whatever category this post is, title, body, author, and created at, which is a date time field, and it's the current timestamp. So this will automatically get filled. We're not going to have to actually add this in our query. And then we have some data, so just some posts with some category IDs, a body, author, created at. And then if we look at our categories table, and we look at the structure, it is just an ID, which is the primary key, the name, and a created at, which again is the current timestamp. And then if we look at the data here, we just have a couple different categories. Okay, just the name and created at. So that's our data structure that we'll be working with. It's very, very simple. So now we can get started with our code. What I'm going to do is open up my htdocs folder. Okay, so since I'm using XAMPP, htdocs is basically my server root. I'm going to create a new folder here, and I'm going to call this php_rest_my_blog, which I already have there, so I have to actually delete that. And let's say PHP my blog rest, nope, PHP rest my blog. You can call it whatever you want, but this is what I'll have it in GitHub as. So I'm going to open this with my text editor. I'm using VS Code, which I highly recommend, but of course you can use whatever you want. Now, as far as our file structure, we basically have three different parts. We're going to have our config folder that's going to hold our database class, which is going to be used to do our core connection to MySQL using PDO. Then we're going to have a models folder that will have our post model and category model. And then we're going to have our front-end facing API folder where that'll have the files that we actually hit in the HTTP client in Postman. All right, so those will be the three basic parts of this project. So let's create a folder called config. So we want to start by creating our database class. So we'll create a file here. I'm going to call database.php. And I gave it a capital D because it is going to be a class, and whenever I create class files, I like to give it an uppercase at the beginning. So let's put in our PHP tag and create a class called database. So this class is going to have some properties, which are basically going to be our database parameters to connect. So these are going to be private, meaning they can only be accessed in this class. So we'll have a host, which is going to be localhost. We're going to have a database name, so I'll say db_name, which I called my blog. We're going to have our username. This is your database username, which I'm using my root user. And then you want your database or your root user's password or whatever user you're using, which in my case is just 1 through 6. And then finally we want a property called conn. This is going to represent our connection. All right, so next thing we want to do is create a method to connect. We'll say dbConnect, and let's give this will be public function, and we'll call it connect. And then first thing I'll do is just set the connection property to null. All right, now whenever you want to access any of these properties, and this is just basic object-oriented principles in PHP, you want to use this and then the arrow. Okay, so we're pertaining to this property here, or attribute. We're just setting it to null, and then we want to basically connect through PDO, meaning we want to create a new PDO object and pass in the stuff we need. So I'm going to actually put this in a try catch block. All right, so we're going to say try catch, and inside catch we're going to put a parameter here. It's going to be PDO exception, which will be a variable. You could call this anything. We're going to call it E. And then in the catch, basically if something goes wrong, if there's an error, we're just going to echo connection error. And let's concatenate on, and we can take that exception variable, and it has a method called getMessage, which will tell us exactly what's going on if it doesn't connect. Okay, now in the try is where we actually want to connect, so we're going to say this con, and we want to set that to a new PDO object. And this takes in a couple things. It takes in what's called a DSN, which is basically your database type and your host. It also takes in your database name, username, password, all the things that are needed to connect. So we want to put some quotes in here, and we're saying MySQL because you can use other types of databases with PDO, and then :host equals, And now the host that we're using is going to be this property right here. So since that's a variable, we need to concatenate. So we're going to put a dot like that and say this host. Then we'll concatenate back to a string, put a semicolon, and then we want the DB name, which will equal, and then we want to concatenate this DB underscore name back to a string, put a semicolon. Actually, we don't need a semicolon because this is actually the last parameter, or the last of this first parameter of the DSN. Now we want the username as a second parameter. So this username, and then the password is the last one. So this password. Okay, and just double check your concatenation here. This stuff used to confuse the hell out of me when I was starting out with PHP. Yeah, that's fine. All right, so now that we've done that, the next thing, or the last thing I want to do here is just set the error mode. I want to be able to get exceptions when we make queries in case something goes wrong, and it'll tell us what's going on. So we're going to say this connection, or con, and then set attribute. What is that? So set attribute, and here we want to say PDO ::attr, so attribute underscore, and then error mode, ERR mode, and then comma, and then we just want to put PDO error mode underscore exception. And that's it. And then PDO has a lot of different attributes that you can set if you want to look at the documentation, or if you want to watch my crash course or whatever. And we also need to return the connection. So under the try catch, we're just going to return this con. And that's it. That's our database class, and that's what we'll use in our model. So let's save this, and that's it. We can close that up. So next thing we're going to do is create another folder called models. This should not be in the config. Didn't mean to do that. Okay, so in models, let's create a new file called post.php, and this is going to be a class. So just like we did with database, we're going to say class, and we're going to call it post. And we want to do some DB stuff here. So we want a private property of CONN representing our connection. And then we want our table for this model, which is going to be posts. All right, then we'll set our properties. I mean, they're all properties, but these are, I guess, our post properties. So like the ID, and I'm going to set these to public. So ID, we're not going to set them to any value. We're just basically initializing them. So let's say public category underscore ID, public. Now here I'm saying category name, and you might be saying, well, we don't have a category name field in our database. We're actually going to use a join in our queries so that we can kind of combine the tables together, and we can get the category name of the post. Okay. We also want a title. We also want the body, author, and what else? Created at. Okay, so that should be all the fields that we want. Now we want to create a constructor. All right, now a constructor, we're going to say with DB. A constructor is basically just a method. A method is a function within a class. And a constructor is a method that runs automatically when you instantiate the class, or when you instantiate an object from a class. And to create this, we're going to say public function and then double underscore construct. Okay, that's how you create a constructor. And then when we instantiate a new post, we're going to pass in a database object. So we're going to say DB right here. And then all we want to do is set the connection of this class to that DB. Okay, just like that. All right, so now what we're going to do is go below the constructor, and we're going to create a method to get post or read posts. So we're going to say public function, we'll call it read. And in here, what we want to do first is create our query. Okay, so we'll create a variable called query, and we're going to set it to select. Let's do select. Now, I'm going to use some aliases here, and we're going to do a join because we need to get that category name. I want that as output when we look at our posts. So we're going to say c.name as category underscore name. I'm actually going to separate this a little bit to kind of make it a little more readable. So we'll go like that. So we want to select c.name as category name. We'll put a comma here. Oops. And then underneath that, we want to get from the post table, we want the ID. I'm going to say p.id. We're using p as an alias. It doesn't know what P or C is yet, but I'll show you where we actually define that. We also want the category ID. Okay, we want the title. We want the body, author, and created at. All right, so we want those from the post table. So we want to go right here. I'm going to go back one and say from, and then we want the name of the table. Now we know it's the post table, but we actually defined it, the table, as a property up here. So we want to put that. So we need to actually put some quotes here and then concatenate, since it's a variable, and say this table, like that. So we're saying from whatever the table is. And then this is where we can just put a P, and we're basically assigning posts as P. So up here, when we say p.id, it knows we mean the post table. Now below that, I'm going to do a left join. And this is probably the most complicated query of this whole thing. Now a join is when you bring in another table. So we want to bring in categories as C. Okay, so this is where we define C as categories, and we want to bring it in on where P category ID is equal to C.id. Okay, so we're making a correlation here between the category ID field in the post table and the ID field in the category table. So that's how we're going to be able to get this category name. Okay. Because categories does have a name field, but we're saying get it as category name. And then the very last thing we want to do in our query is just order. So we're going to say order by, and let's order by the post table created at field, and we'll say descending. All right, I'll just put this quote up here. Okay, now if I just did created at, it would get confused because both well, actually, we didn't select it from the category table, but both of them do have a created at field, so it's good to have these aliases. So that's our query. I realize it is a little advanced if you've never done joins or anything. If you watch my PHP front to back course, we do go into joins and stuff like that. And I do also have an SQL crash course, which is about an hour long. I try to cover most of the technologies. You know, web development stuff. So we want to put a semicolon there, and then next thing we want to do after we create our query is create our prepared statement. Okay, so we're going to create a variable. The convention is stmt for statement, and then we're going to take our connection, so this con, and we want to call the prepare. Okay, so this is PDO right here. So we want to prepare our query. Okay, once we have that statement, we're just preparing it. We haven't executed it yet, so that's what we want to do next, is we want to execute the query, and we can do that by saying stmt, and it has a method called execute. And then the last thing we want to do here is just return our statement. All right, so that is our read method. Hopefully I didn't make any mistakes. So we'll just save that. Now, I don't want to end this video yet because I want us to actually have some kind of result. So I want to be able to at least make a GET request and get our data. So now we're going to create our API folder, which is like kind of like just our front-facing API that we're going to be able to access. And let's create a folder in here called post. So anything to do with posts will go in here. So I'm going to create a file called read.php. So this file here, we're going to interact with the model. So let's start off here. Of course, we need our PHP tags. And since this is going to be a REST API that we're going to access through HTTP, we need to add a couple headers. So in PHP, we have the header function we can use. And I'm going to add the access-control-allow-origin. And since this is a completely public API, I'm just going to put an asterisk here. Okay, so this should be able to be accessed by anybody. We're not getting into authorization or tokens or anything like that. That's way beyond this, what we're doing here. And then I also just want to add the header value of content type. And we want to say that we want to accept JSON, which the MIME type or whatever is application/JSON. All right. And then we need to bring in, we're going to say include once. We need to bring in the database, which is, it's up two directories. So .. And then it's in the config folder and then database.php. And actually, I'll just copy that down. Then we also want to bring in models, and we want to bring in our post model. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and instantiate our database object. Instantiate database, and we also want to connect to it. So for that, we'll create a variable called database, set it to a new database object. And then we'll create a variable for our basically our connection, and we'll set that to database connect. Okay, and that connect is the one that we created. So if we look at our database class, we have our connect. It's going to do all this stuff. All right, so now that we've done that, let's instantiate our post object. I'll say blog post object so we don't get confused with like a post request, and say post equals new post. Now remember, when we created our constructor in the post, it takes in this DB and then it adds it to the connection so that we can go and we can do our stuff down here with our query. So we need to pass in that DB object like that. All right, now once we do that, we want to basically call our read method. Okay, this right here, our read function inside the post class. So let's say blog post query, and we can say, let's create a variable, we'll just call it result, and we'll set it to post read. And then I also want to get the row count. So right here, I'm going to say get row count, and we can do that. Let's create a variable, just call it num, and we'll set that to our result, and then it has a method called row count. Oops. Like that. So we want to basically check to see if there's any posts. So let's say check if any posts, so we can just check that num value. So we'll say if num is greater than 0, that means there's posts. We're going to have an else here as well. So if there's posts, first thing we're going to do is initialize an array. So I'm going to say posts underscore ARR and just set it to array. So just a blank array. And then the way that I want to structure this is when we make a request, I don't want I don't want it to just return a JSON array with the data. I want it to have a data value inside and then have it, just in case we want to add other stuff other than the data, like pagination stuff, or I don't know, maybe just like a version info, anything like that. So I'm also going to do this. I'm going to say posts posts array. So we're going to take that post array we just created, and then we're going to say data and set that also to an array, and that's where the actual data is going to go. So now this result, this result is going to give us, the result from the read function that we created. So we want to loop through that. So to do that, we'll create a while loop. And inside here, we're going to say while, and then we're going to have a variable called row and set that to result fetch. And then remember, we're using PDO, and we can fetch it as different things. I want to fetch it as an associative array. So we're going to say PDO _, fetch _ assoc. Okay, and you can watch my PDO crash course to learn more about what we can get and stuff like that. Now, this row variable, we'll be able to access the data. Like if we want the title, we could say row title, like that. But I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want to extract this, whatever this is, and have that as a variable. So what we can do is we can use extract and then pass in row, and now we'll be able to use like title and body and stuff like that instead of that row title, row body. All right, now we want to create a post item for each post. So I'm going to say post item equals an array, and inside here I'm going to say, let's say ID is going to be ID, title, body. Now the body, usually in a blog, the body is allowed to have HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this in a function, a PHP function called HTML entity decode, and then pass in body like that. All right, and then also author and category ID. And also category name. Remember that our query will also give us that. All right. So now the next thing we want to do is take this right here, the data value in the post array, and we want to basically push to that. So under the post item, let's say push, we'll say push to, and we want to push to the data. So we'll say array _ push, which is just a PHP method to do just that. And we want to take the posts _ array and then the data value. And then what we want to push onto it is this post item. Okay, and it's going to loop through each post and do this for each one. Now we want to go outside of the loop, which ends right here, and we want to turn it to JSON, because right now it's just a PHP array and we don't want that. We want to turn this to JSON and we want to output. So for that we'll say echo, and then we have a function called JSON encode, and we want to pass in our posts array. Okay, and that should do it. And then else, meaning that if num is 0, meaning if there's no posts, what do we want to do? We want to just echo out, actually just put a comment here, no posts. We'll echo out JSON encode, and we'll just put an array in here. and say message, and we'll set that to no posts found. All right, so that should do it. Let's save this, and now we should be able to do this. We should be able to test it out. So let's go to Postman, and we're going to make a GET request to HTTP localhost / what the hell did I call this? PHP rest my blog / and then API / and you could, if you want, you can map this to a host using your host file. If you don't want to use like localhost / something, you could map it to a local domain, but I'm not going to go through that. API / post / read.php. Okay, make sure it's a GET request, and let's click send, and there we go. So as you can see here, we have a JSON object which has a value of data, and that value, or a key of data I should say, and that value is an array of our posts. Okay, and if you look at each one, we have the ID, we have the title of the post, we have the body, which is just some dummy text, we have the author, the category ID, and we also have the category name. Okay, and remember that category name is not an actual field in our post table. We did a join with the categories table, and that's how we got that. All right, so I think that this is a good place to stop, guys. In the next video, I want to do two things, hopefully, depending on how long it is. I want to be able to get a single post, because right now we're getting all of them. I want to be able to get a single post, and then I also want to be able to create a post. So we'll have to make, instead of a GET, we'll make a post request. So what that means is that we'll have to add to our post model. So we're going to add a read single and a create method, and then we'll have to also create those files to hit with our client. All right, so that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you in the next video.